there's all these different things, right? Instead of saying, hey, what's right for the individual? And so everything that I talk about and that I want to put out there is speaking to the middle way that, like, hey, for instance, with cannabis, it can be a great spiritual aid and ally in your life. It can also be a permission slip you write yourself to not live the life that you were meant to live. It could be anything within that spectrum, but ultimately it's up to you to discern for yourself when and where, if it's correct, you use it in your life.
Welcome to the Embrace and Expand podcast, where we talk about everything from spirituality, self-development, relationships, mindfulness, wellness, and everything that will help you embrace all that you are so you can expand into the best version of yourself. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Embrace and Expand podcast. So normally I would go through a big intro of our guests, but this is a part 2 of Ryan Sprague, who was with us last week. And because we had such an epic conversation and really didn't get to touch on a lot of the topics that I think we actually wanted to touch on, here we are again. So everyone, welcome Ryan back to the show. Ryan, how are you doing?
Oh man, so great to be here with you, Adam. I was saying when we started recording on my show, I was like, man, I feel lucky. I get 2 whole hours with you today, plus a little bit more. We've been chatting, and so I feel extremely grateful to be here and to dive back down the rabbit hole with you, man.
Yeah, so for all of you that don't understand what we just referenced to, so we just got done doing a podcast on Ryan's podcast, this one time on psychedelics. And so you will definitely put in this show notes of a link to that podcast so you guys can go check that out, because we have talked about some things that I haven't talked about on this podcast before. So that's what's fun about joining up with other podcasters, is you get to have unique conversations that you normally maybe don't share on your podcast, or share things in a slightly different way.
Yeah, I absolutely love that, that aspect, because again, like, especially when you're in this world, right? Like, you're a podcaster, you're into fitness, you're into all these things. Sometimes, right, like the things you love in life, you haven't thought about in a way that someone else would present them, because like you've just learned this certain way to look at them. And so I love being able to jump on other people's shows, because the questions I get asked force me to think about things in ways that I hadn't thought about them before. And as a result, I grow and learn. And so it literally feels like it should be illegal how much fun it is, being able to just like talk and riff and connect. I mean, these are the things I love most in life. So being able to do it on podcasts and learn more about myself and supply the listeners with some really cool people and be able to have these amazing riff sessions is just awesome, man. It's so much fun.
Yeah, and it's unique at how everyone having a slightly different perspective can yield a different answer to the exact same question. Just as we touched on with the Embrace and Expand signature question of, what did you have to embrace in your life in order to expand into the person you are today? It's unique in how that answer presents itself for each and every person. And so far throughout both seasons of the podcast, we've only ever had the same answer said twice. And so for so many different people to receive that question, but come up with their own unique answers based upon their life experiences, such a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. It's like, I think this is really, at least for me, like the gem of life, right? Like being able to understand that we all do have different realities. We're living in, let's say, objectively, maybe the same world, right? Like same setting, let's say, but also we're viewing it with different eyes. And so there's always an opportunity to learn based on how someone else views the world. And it's funny because today, my buddy Jason Skisick dropped an episode that him and I did live at the Lake House back in October. And I was saying in that episode, I caught the clip of it. I was saying, like, I don't know necessarily if I'm going to have the best experience of my life 5 minutes from now, right? I don't know if someone else's belief systems are going to be cooler than the ones I have. And so why don't I take those on, right? Like, I choose to understand that what I believe now in the moment is the best depiction of what I want that area of my life to look like. But what has happened so often in my life is someone else says something, I'm like, dude, that's actually way cooler and I like that more. So I'm going to grab that. But I wouldn't know that if I wasn't like talking to other individuals, And I think that's what Ram Dass meant, at least in one way, when he said we're all walking each other home, right? Like you can take that many different ways. But the first thing that pops through to me is the ability to allow us to understand ourselves through the reflections of other people. And that's exactly my understanding of God, right? And why God is choosing to have this infinite source of different, contextualizations and, personalities and traits and all of these things. It's to understand itself to a deeper level. And so we really are just the microcosm of the macrocosm.
Yeah, I mean that's such a great way to put it. And I think I also watched that clip earlier that you were referencing to, and it was unique in how when you present that information in such a way, but you yourself are also open to receiving that information and aren't so rigid in your beliefs that stops you from being able to receive that transmission that's happening right then and there.
100%. Because, and by no means is this always easy, right? Like it's simple, but it's not necessarily easy. I love that dichotomy, easy to simple. But, it's like, for me, I kicked and screamed for a long time when mentors and coaches and whatever would call me on some stuff that maybe I wasn't paying enough attention to, or that I was maybe aware of, but telling myself it wasn't that big of a deal. But when they were able to give me like the way in which they view their life that allowed them to come up with that realization for me, I was like, oh, actually, I like that. And that's very empowering, And so it's so powerful to be able to like just relate with people. Sometimes it is a kick in the balls, but at the same time, like we were talking about on the end of my show, like, oftentimes I've realized the biggest kicks in the balls are followed by the most immense sources of power opening up, because a lot of times you realize in that moment, oh, it was just me that blocked myself from, XYZ thing. And so if it was me that blocked myself, now I get to love myself in a way where I can figure out why I blocked myself and hopefully not do that again, and if I do it again, then I get to learn, okay, where was my holdup there, or where's my hang up? And so I choose to look at life as a learning experience because, and this is what I was saying in the clip too, it's like, I like being the learner rather than the knower, because knowing gets us into a lot of issues in life. And if you go on Facebook or Instagram specifically, or TikTok, I don't even know because I'm not on there, but you just see people wasting energy all day trying to prove each other wrong, right? Or prove themselves right. And in reality, even if they proved objectively somehow that they were right, the other person is not going to all of a sudden lower their armor and decide to take on their belief system. So they'll all suffice to say, they're both in fight or flight, trying to prove each other's identity is more right than the other person's identity. And there's never any resolution to that, right? And so it's one of those experiences where, like, I started realizing that being the knower in life just gets me into these weird battles where, like, I'm trying to, like, prove to myself that the way and thing that I know to be true is the best thing, when in reality, I choose to be the learner, because the learner understands that maybe right now I understand something to be one way, but if I start understanding it in a different way, oh, I can learn from that. And so, like I was saying in the clip, it's like learners are always winning, whether they get it quote unquote wrong and they're like, great, now I have something new to learn, or they get it right and they go, hey, why did I get that right? What can I learn from how I did that so I can continue doing that in the future? I think that's one of the best reasons why, I just enjoy being a learner. It came through a lot of time of, trying to be the knower and getting myself into all these weird situations, and then realizing, like, I don't even care to know things, and that's one of the big things cannabis helped me with. And I think this is one of the big things that cannabis can help a lot of people with, because let's say that, for instance, someone believes the earth is flat, someone believes it's round. That could be a very heated discussion in a sober state of reality. Typically what happens, though, if you connect with cannabis and someone says, I believe the earth's flat, I'm just like, dude, tell me your case. All right. Like, tell me why you believe this. I want to know all the things. Right. Whereas maybe in my sober state of reality, this is kind of a silly example of this, but I would have been triggered enough to be like, no, it would never be flat. And I wouldn't potentially learn something from that person, right? Doesn't mean that I have to walk away believing the earth is flat, but it means that I understand at least the argument. And I can go, oh, cool. Well, I haven't been to outer space, so I don't know objectively, right? And even if I did, who knows, right? Like, things could be obscured, who knows, right? So I think that one of the other thirst traps with knowing things is that what I've found is that the times that I enjoy the most in life are when I realize how much I don't know in that moment, because it allows me to remember that I haven't done everything in life, right? Like, I haven't, like, there's always new things that could come forth. And I think that one of the things that makes people stall out is they go through the same routines, they drive the same way to work, they eat the same foods, and life just becomes bland. And so realizing that the mystery in life is actually what I loved the most. When I realized that, I was like, well, why the hell would I ever want to know anything? And so I have this happen a lot on Instagram where I'll make a post about cannabis, about what I choose to believe about it. And I have people trying to tell me I'm wrong. I'm like, guys, you don't have to agree with me. I'm not doing this so people agree with me. I'm doing it so I can have a discussion. So if you want to have a discussion, let's go. Right. But at the end of the day, it's like, I think a lot of people just immediately go on the attack. That's not true. And it's like, well, hey, if you don't want it to be true, then guess what? It won't be true. So no worries.
That's such a good point. And I don't understand that perspective on why do you immediately feel the need to attack another person when they have a different point of view? Because I'm just like you. I'm like, I want to learn as much as I possibly can. And if somebody has information that can help me to achieve a result faster, easier, more efficiently, I'm all for it. At the same time, if I try it, I'm like, yeah, the way that I do it just works better for me, then of course I'm just going to go back to that way. But if I'm not open to being able to receive that information and be able to see another way of doing something, then I'm just shortening myself and my ability to actually receive more knowledge by having that rigid stance of I know it.
Mm-hmm.
So even though you know a different way, my way is the right way, your way is the wrong way. So let's argue about it instead of why don't we talk about it and see, is there a better way? Or maybe we can combine our two different ways together and create a third way that's even better than either of us could have imagined.
Exactly. And that's like, again, it's like for me, what I started realizing too was, when it comes to the idea of knowing versus learning, proving people wrong, wasting energy, all of these things, what I realized was, at least in my own experience, when I was worried about proving myself right, it was because deep down, I felt like I had to control, like I felt like I wasn't fully trusting in my experience as a spiritual being having a human experience, right? So I was so attached to the lower self that like my worth was dictated by how right I was, what I knew, these kind of things. And, I think for many people, they might be able to relate to a time in their life that they felt like this, and so being able to break through that and realize that, if I post something and someone completely shit talks me, I leave feeling just the same as I went into that post, because at the end of the day, I didn't post it to get validation. I posted it because I was like, I think this is really cool. And I'm curious if anyone else does. And so when people waste their energy coming on and trying to like prove me wrong, I'm like, guys, let's have a discussion. I'm completely open. I don't pretend to know, but I choose to believe what I do based on what helps my experience of life be the greatest and grandest possible. And the interesting thing is, I know for me anyway, and I'll keep it personal, not to project, but I know for me that when I was in that state of mind of trying to prove myself right, I wasn't happy. I wasn't fulfilled, and so whenever people do that, I imagine that the state they might be going through is similar to mine. And so I always leave them with a caveat, like, hey, wishing you the best, like there's nothing but love here. Like I'm not doing these things or saying these things. Like, listen, when I started getting into talking about how cannabis can be a spiritual aid and ally and how we can balance it in their lives, I knew it wasn't exactly going to be a path where everyone agreed with me, right? But I came to a point where I realized, am I going to silence my own truth because of people that are potentially hurting and projecting that and want to beat people down? Maybe that's what they learned. Again, doesn't make them bad people. It's just that's what they're doing. Do I want to silence myself for those people? Is that actually going to help anyone? Is that going to set an example for other people of how they should spread their truth? No, it's not. And so I think the biggest thing for me, and we talked about this a little bit in the episode we did on my show, but, it comes down to your why, right? Like, if you really know your why, you can bear almost anyhow. And so for me, I understand why I'm doing this, who I'm doing it for, what my goals are for it. And so I understand that during that time, like, there are going to be people that decide to hate on me or do those kind of things. But at the end of the day, it's my opportunity to learn from that and not get triggered, right? So, I take it as a learning experience, because sometimes like people will leave that and I'll feel the heart rate start to increase. And I'm like, oh, wait, like I don't have to feel like that. I have nothing to prove to anyone. I'm not here to prove anything right. I'm here to just talk about things openly, because like I was saying with my core values before, it's like one of my core values is being the middle way. because we have this hyperpolarization in society right now that is just like such another thirst trap, where it's like, eat all the eggs you possibly want. Eggs are going to give you cancer. You should go carnivore. You should be vegan. It's like there's all these different things, right? Instead of saying, hey, what's right for the individual? And so everything that I talk about and that I want to put out there is speaking to the middle way, that like, hey, for instance, with cannabis, it can be a great spiritual aid and ally in your life. It can also be a permission slip you write yourself to not live the life that you were meant to live. It could be anything within that spectrum, but ultimately it's up to you to discern for yourself when and where, if it's correct, you use it in your life, And so if you apply that to everything going on, it really allows you to get into this very interesting state that, allows you to look at life as less black and white and more, I guess, more like cooking than baking, and what I found is that, like, in my own life, there are certain things that I don't mind doing, like baking. For instance, like I have my morning routine. I like that part, like baking for now anyway. But, when it comes to like true fulfillment, fun, enjoyment, joy, those things I found are much better done cooking than baking. Like they're much more like of a, I don't know how to put it, but like much more of a feminine thing overall. And that's the best way I could say it, is more of a yin thing, where it's kind of flowy, like it's not always the same recipe that equals the same result, but it's just what feels right in the moment, And so I'm glad we're talking about this, because, I really feel that's something that a lot of people could benefit from. It was just like understanding this discernment between like, hey, do I have to like agree with everyone? Can I just like state what I believe and choose to believe it because it helps my life be better, and maybe it helps someone else's life be better? Bonus points. But it allows us to be accepting of ourselves, to show these things and these sides of ourselves to the world around us. And so I found it very beneficial for sure.
I love that. And I want to kind of take a little dial back to your point about posting for validation. Are you making a post seeking validation from somebody that you're doing the right thing, or you're saying the right thing, or you're being the right person, or, you're following a path that people are going to be accepting of? And I'll use my personal example of sharing about my journey with cannabis through the podcast. This is the first time that I've openly shared about it. I'd never shared about it on social media because it was always the worry of, what are people going to think? What are people who have followed me for years, who have no idea that I consume, and at that point in time consumed on a daily basis? What are they going to think? Are they going to look at me negatively? Are they going to look at me differently? Now I'm in such a place in my life where, one, I don't really care, because how you look at me says everything about you, not about me. How I look at me says everything about me. And so if I have fear on sharing something because I'm worried about what people are going to think, that actually points the finger back at myself of, how do I look at myself for doing these things? And the moment I started asking myself that question was the realization that, oh, it's because I know my consumption has gotten to an unhealthy level. I know this is not what I'm supposed to be doing in every single moment of the day when I have any sort of free time. Instead, that free time should be spent doing other things that I know would continue me on the path that I'm wanting to go down, which has kind of led me to where I've not totally cut it out my life, but for the most part, it's not really a daily present thing, or even a weekly present thing for me, or even a monthly present thing at this point, because I'm on such a forward focused path in my spiritual journey, in starting my new business and doing this podcast, that I know I need to maintain that focus. At the same time, I do recognize where there's certain times where it's like, okay, that did give me the permission slip to just relax, to just laugh at a funny video, or just be silly and be present in the moment, instead of worrying about, okay, what's the next task I got to check off of my checklist? What's the next thing that I have to do to maybe, again, start feeding validation that I'm being a productive person, or being a adult that is leading a successful life, when success looks different for every single person.
Definitely. 100%. And, one of the things I found too is I'll speak to this point first, and there's another one I want to touch on too. But, we were talking briefly in the episode we did on my show. I think I've said that like 5 times now. If anyone wants to hit a bag for every time you say, you hear me say when we were on my show, but like we talked about how there's 8 billion people in the world. Right. And so, at the end of the day, like, for a while, I realized that I was halting my truth because I wanted to be liked by everyone. I wanted to make sure that everyone was comfortable. I didn't want to offend people. I never do, right? But, I don't go out looking to offend anyone by what I say or anything. But I realized that, like, I was living a falsehood where I realized, like, would I really like 8 million people to like me? Like, that would be overwhelming as hell, right? So when I realized that, like, there's no chance I would even want that, well, I realized that to the degree that I limit what I say in my own truth is the degree that I might be keeping people around who honestly I'm not the best for, and they might not be the best for me. And so it was kind of selfish in a way, is what I realized is like, if I'm not being blatantly honest with who I am, what I feel, etc., there's going to be a lot of people that might really just not know I'm that person and might be like, oh, darn, I wish I might have listened to someone else that didn't do this one thing or whatever, right? So at the end of the day, I realized that if I do speak my truth, then I'm going to pull in the people that are resonating with that message. And those are the people that I'm meant to talk to, and meant to potentially help and coach and all of these kind of things and help guide, And so when I realized that, it really helped a lot, and I think that for a lot of us, at least a lot of people I've worked with, they go through the same challenge, right? Where they're kind of saying like, yeah, like actually that makes a lot of sense. Like I really wouldn't want that many people to be reaching out to me. I mean, it would just be so overwhelming, and so that's definitely something that I found is very beneficial as I've taken that belief system on to be able to allow me to spread my own truth without worrying so much about it. And what you said about cannabis too, it's like, how I view cannabis and other psychedelics at this point in my life is that I know where I'm going, right? Like I'm on a forward momentum. Like I have a lot of things figured out. I have a lot of things I don't have figured out, but I have a pretty good course of like a general direction that I'm going in, But I'm also aware that this sometimes is very cunning and gets in the way, right? And so I like to have these moments with cannabis. It's usually once or twice per week on the weekend, where when I take a break and I take a zoomed out view of like just what I did that past week, I'm like, is that really in alignment with my why? Like, is that thing that I told myself was a necessity, or that thing that I prioritized, was that actually allowing me to accomplish the big why at the end? Sometimes it's like, oh, that was great. Sometimes it's like, ooh, no, what happened there? Okay, shadow coming up, some type of validation thing, whatever happens, right? But I think these moments where, we have a lot of forward momentum, it's important to keep that going. And it's also important to understand that plants like cannabis, they will help you relax. But if you know where you're going and you're excited to get there, relaxation is definitely a necessity, but it's not the only button you should have either, right? It's like finding that balance again, right? And so what I found is that it helps me once or twice per week to just have that zoom out view and just make sure that I'm still in alignment with everything I'm doing. And then maybe once a year, I go on a large dose of psilocybin, usually on Valentine's Day, and I just really take a zoom out view of everything. And I just like allow myself to process whatever maybe I hadn't processed, and that really helps me just make sure that I'm still having forward momentum, but that I also am like, doing due diligence to take a zoom out every once in a while and just make sure that I'm not getting tricked by the mind or any of these belief systems or apps, as you would put it, right? Like any of these apps that maybe I'm still unaware of what they fully are. So every once in a while, I like to do the zoom out view and just make sure like, okay, I still like all the apps I have. I don't want to take any of these off. All the apps I'm using are leading me to my common goal. Okay, this is perfect. I'll keep going.
Yeah. So while we've kind of continued to be on the subject of cannabis, I would really like to dive into your wealth of knowledge around this, Ryan, because I think we both have a fairly deep knowledge and understanding of the plant, but I think many of the listeners may be being like, okay, I've tried it once or twice, didn't really jive for me. But you and I both know that, like, back in the day where weed was just weed, like, you got what you got and you had no idea. Was it a sativa? Was it an indica? Was it a hybrid? Did it have this specific terpene profile? Did it have this specific terpene profile? For people who are maybe looking to try using cannabis as a tool on their spiritual development journey, what would your advice be to look at? And we can also kind of dive into how that looks differently for every single person.
Yeah. So just like you said, it will be a little bit different for everyone. But what I found objectively, or as close to objectively as possible, is starting out with your why, right? Like, what are you currently experiencing in your life, just overall, right? Like, let the truth come out of you and just figure out, like, what do you really like about your life? What's kind of challenging right now? And what do you feel about this pull to cannabis, right? Like, what are you hoping it can help you with? What are you maybe unsure about? Like, for instance, maybe they tried it a couple of times, it didn't jive with them, they're nervous, they're scared, they're anxious, these kind of things. Get as much as you can out on paper. That way, all of that information is going to be really useful if and when you do go into an experience. Because let's say, especially for those of us that have had challenges with cannabis before, like Aubrey said in the show that we did, it was like, you know, cannabis can be extremely challenging, like almost more so than most other medicines, especially like, I mean, that's what I've experienced. Like high doses of edibles specifically can be extremely challenging. And so if someone has gone through one of those experiences or even a micro experience that was, anxiety provoking or something like that, they have the ability to reinstate that experience again. Just from thinking and focusing on it so much. It's almost like the waiting room we talked about before, right? Like that idea of like being stuck in whatever subconscious loop was in there. Because what a lot of people don't understand about cannabis is that cannabis allows our brain waves to go from beta into alpha and theta, which are the doorway to the subconscious, right? So if you're not making a very conscious intention, and even sometimes if you do, but making an intention can help with this, but especially if you don't make a conscious intention, it's not that you don't make an intention. Your intention is whatever the hell is rattling around in there, right? And so that's why it's so important to make an intention. Now, like I said, even if you do make an intention, there can be challenges that come up. But here's the difference. There's a way to contextualize them in most cases anyway. So let's say, for an example, that someone makes the intention to be happy, right? They want to experience happiness. So they go into this experience and what they first start feeling is anxiety, paranoia, maybe even a little depression thrown in there, these kind of things. Well, if they hadn't made that intention, they would just end up probably believing cannabis did this to me and I'm not using that anymore, right? If they did make the intention, they have the ability to at least go, okay, while I'm experiencing these things, my intention was to be happy. Maybe these are the things that I've been not processing that are going to allow me to access happiness more regularly in my day-to-day life, And so there's this ability to be the creator of your reality and therefore everything in your reality, such as your ceremonies, and be able to find a way in which what is happening for you and not to you. So I would say start with the why, right? Get everything out on paper, what you're going through, what your feelings are about cannabis, maybe how it's helped you in the past if you do have a history with it, maybe if you've been dependent on it, what you can now notice is maybe the reason you became dependent, or at least a generalization of the reason, maybe uncomfortable feelings, whatever it is. Once you get all that out on paper, that's a pretty good place to start in terms of awareness. And then from there, what I would say is the second part is structure, right? So, not just like what we talk about as the highly optimized way, like our 4-step process, those kind of things, but being able to say like, okay, I like this plant, I like connecting with it, but how am I to know if this is still helping me or if I'm storying myself into numbing out with it, right? So for instance, how it looks for me is 90% of the time, I would say, maybe 95, I'm between Monday and Friday, no cannabis, right? The exceptions are like if I'm on vacation or if I'm hanging out with Paul Check or someone like that on a Wednesday, I'm not going to be like, no, sorry. I've also been doing this for 4 years now. So I now have a lot of confidence in myself to be able to stick to that pattern. So what I want to illuminate here too is structure is amazing and very necessary in the beginning. And it's still necessary as you go throughout the process, but you can be a little bit more like lenient with it as you get more into it, because again, neurons that fire together wire together. And so if you start understanding and doing these patterns, right, and sticking to your structure, you can go a little bit off of it from time to time and come right back to it. It's kind of like, if you're really into dieting and eating healthy and all of these things, doesn't mean that every once in a while you can have a piece of chocolate cake, right? It just means that like, do you want to have that now every night because you had it that one day? No, right? So it's very similar to food in that way. And so figuring out like, for me, like, okay, Monday through Friday, I'm not going to connect with cannabis. And my reasoning for that was because Monday through Friday is when I'm the most prone to stress. So those are the times that I want to be sober so that I at least can either feel those things or realize that I can't feel them. And then that weekend I can be like, why the hell could I not feel that stuff and go into there, right? So what I tell everyone is a good rule of thumb in terms of where to start with this is whatever you can't take 3 days off of owns you, right? Now, again, we talked about this before too, in the show we did together before this, that, there are some people that like, hey, they might be listening to this and they're like, I'm a daily user and it seems to be working okay. Cool. We're not saying you're wrong, right? Like again, I'm not here to tell people what the right or wrong answers are. But if you're someone who right now is like, oh, I feel attacked, right? Like that is the type of person I'm talking to and saying like structure like this could really help you, and having that 3-day break per week is not only going to help your psyche and like just like your ability to feel confident and not being dependent on the plant. It's also going to help the plant work more transcendentally and spiritually in your experience. And so if you're also really excited about the idea of this plant being able to be a tool in your life, right? Being able to be a friend in your life, an ally, an ally, it's almost like a mentor is I think the closest word I can find, because mentors, they can beam you up. They can also set you right when you might be missing something. And so it's important to understand that, any good mentor will work that way, right? Like that's part of the reason that you work with a mentor. You don't work with them so every time you show up, they're like, everything's great, man, you're crushing it. You do that or you work with them because every once in a while you want them to go, are you catching this? I've seen this pattern in you, right? And so cannabis will work very similar. And so being able to understand your why and then figuring out a structure of like what healthy use looks like for you, clear measurements that way, because again, no one's going to come save the day for you, right? Like no one's going to come tell you you're smoking too much cannabis, right? Like, I mean, maybe if you go to a therapist or something, but in most cases, you're going to have to understand what that is for each individual. And so that's where I would say to start, why, and then structure.
I love that. And especially since you put on the emphasis on each individual, because those answers are going to be different for every individual, but also the usage is going to be different for every individual. And if you've been using for an extended period of time, especially using on a daily basis, your tolerance is going to be very, very different than when you take a break and you allow that to start exiting out of your system and kind of hit that reset on the tolerance level. And then you come back to it and maybe you'll find that you actually don't need as much as you once did to achieve the same effect. And especially if you consistently start to take breaks. And this is one thing that I had to learn the hard way the first time I took a long break, and then I came back to it and I hit it just like I did beforehand. Cannabis slapped me in the face and was like, hey, you are abusing more than connecting with this plant. And that's when I quickly realized like, oh, I actually don't need to smoke an entire joint to myself to get to the same space. Now all I need is just a couple of hits, and I actually can achieve that aligned center of being and that open mentality that lets me channel in new information, that lets me feel more into my body, that lets me be more present in the moment instead of being disconnected and up off in the clouds.
Definitely 100%, and it is interesting too, because what I found is since starting to take these breaks every week 4 years ago, just about 4 years ago, what I found is that like I just never crave like concentrates, hash, any of that, because I just don't need it. Like my tolerance is so low. I've gotten used to it now where like I know after a 5-day break exactly how much to connect with. And most of the time it's going to be a similar experience. Sometimes things do happen where I'm like, whoa, I didn't realize that was in there. But most of the time, like, like anything, right? Like any friend you hang out with, you kind of get used to how they're going to respond to things and things like that. And, this is one of the things I found, I think once again, we talked about this a little bit before, but, I found that like truly like it's in the breaks and the times of abstinence that you really discover like the subtleties of the plant, because a lot of life is subtleties, like what is meditating? It's tuning into the subtleties of what's around you, right? What is breath work? Tuning into the subtleties through something that's not so subtle usually, but you're allowed, like when you have those breath holds, you're tuning in to like the 0-point field or the unified field or these kind of things. And so a lot of like, cannabis work is subtle as well. And so like it took a long time for me also doing a lot of other spiritual development alongside it to really be able to understand the subtleties. And I imagine there's many that I've yet to discover, right? And so, the more that we can take these breaks and just get curious and just be scientists, right? Like try taking a week off, try using it every day, right? Try taking a 3-day break, try taking a month off, right? Just try different things and figure out what works for you, because my ultimate intention is just to make people ask the question, yeah, why do I use cannabis so much? And from that question, you can either go, I'm okay with that, cool, or maybe there is something and I want to dive into it. But ultimately, your gut and your heart, you'll feel, right? Like if there's something there for you to dive into, usually because it will trigger you, like when we're talking about protectors, anything that we use to help cope, like nicotine, pornography, anything that's like a pattern of coping for us. Typically, when we discover those things, we're not going to be like, oh, yes, I'm so excited. I just realized that I'm addicted to cannabis or I'm dependent on cannabis. Oh my God, I'm so excited, right? Like it's usually not going to be that. It's probably going to be a little bit more challenging. It might, lead to that after, as it did for me, and it sounds like it did for you too, and like I think that when you prove to yourself that you can have cravings and say no, when you prove to yourself that you can go against what the mind and those programs, those apps that maybe we're not so fond of are telling us, how we do anything is how we do everything. So if we can do it with cannabis, we're more likely to do it in our business, with our relationships, with our friendships, with our own health. It's like, I really feel like anything in life can be a training ground for really anything else. It's almost like Mr. Miyagi, wax on, wax off, right? In one way, he was waxing a car and waxing it off, right? Another way, he was learning karate, right? So I think of working with cannabis in a very similar way. It's not the only way you can do this. It's just one of many rivers that lead to ultimately the same sea, right at the end. But it's a river that I've discerned I really like, and it really works for me. And it's not always easy. But it is always simple. Like the things that cannabis shows me are so ridiculously simple. And that's the part that really throws me for a loop sometimes, is because, like I've been someone who, maybe after the episode we did, being a highly sensitive person, specifically in my mental state, I make things so complicated. Like I'll just overcomplicate things to death, and also make things that are supposed to be fun into like very serious things. Sometimes it's like a very interesting thing that happens to me. And so with cannabis, it's always just like, it's this. And I'm like, no, but it's got to be over here. And then we got to draw our line up here and over there. And Plant's like, you can do that if you want, but it's just this. And I'm like, oh, no, because I don't want to think it's just like the root cause, right? So the ego is really good at weaving all these patterns to make you not see the real thing. And so that's another reason I love cannabis so much, because unlike other medicines that are obliterating the ego and default mode network are still online. So you can see this back and forth, right? You can see this back and forth of connecting yourself to the wisdom of the plant, your heart and soul coming online, but your mind still being there. And so it allows you to really, once again, contextualize these different voices and be more apt, if we integrate after, to be able to spot them in real time in your day-to-day life and be able to discern which voice is the one you want to listen to. Like, for instance, if you're making an important decision with your romantic partner, probably want to come from the heart, right? Now, if you're figuring out how to schedule 5 things, you're probably going to want to use the mind, right? So it's not that any one of these things is bad, but what I found in my own life, and I'm sure many people can relate to this, is that this was being used for like 99% of all the decisions I made. And it was because really we've only been praised to use this since we were 6, right? And we started going to school, and then it became about what can you memorize? How well can you do on tests? How well can you sit still, right? Like it totally took the intuitive nature, the heart flow, all of that out of it. And again, I'm not going to say that's a bad thing. It's just a thing, right? That a lot of us are now dealing with at later ages, And so being able to discern those voices has been another one of the amazing, gems that I've gotten as a result of connecting with cannabis in this way.
Mm. So many good things in that. And I'm really trying to decide like what direction to go to, because there's so many different directions that we can continue to take this conversation. But what's truly fascinating for me is that when you learn to see the ego as not this thing that you're trying to kill and eradicate and eliminate from your life, but recognizing that the ego has a purpose. One side of that purpose is to keep you safe. Mm-hmm. Another side of that purpose, when worked with in a spiritual aspect, is to help you achieve higher states of consciousness. And so if you completely remove the ego out of the question, in my opinion, it makes it so much more difficult to integrate the information that you received during that experience, comparatively to almost every single cannabis journey that I've ever taken. Because my ego is still online, it's so much more easy to integrate that experience into my day-to-day versus I've talked about this numerous times on the podcast of, it's been almost 5 years since I last visited ayahuasca, because I'm still integrating some of the information that I received during that experience. If my ego was allowed to be a part of that conversation, I feel like I would have been able to integrate a lot of that stuff much quicker than what I've been able to. Whereas like cannabis, it's like, oh, the very next day I was like, okay, I heard you. Thanks, Mama Ganja. Like, I get where I'm supposed to go now, and then I can start making moves. So it's this interesting dichotomy within the psychedelic community of like, no, you want to have these ego death experiences. And yes, I'm not trying to downplay the importance of those experiences, because I do believe the ego needs a check from time to time. To recognize that our soul is the one that's actually in charge, not the ego. But at the same time, we are here living a very physical 3D experience. The ego is a part of that. So we can't completely get rid of it. And as Ram Dass says, it's an impossibility. You can try as hard as you want, but you're never going to be able to achieve it.
Absolutely. I mean, dude, I 100% agree with that. And I'm so glad, again, like just on the same page. Like I talk about this a lot. I'm like, guys, you want to have a really bad time, go into a deep, psychedelic journey and make the intention to kill your ego. Like essentially, what are you saying? I want a part of me to die during this experience. Yeah, cool story. You're going to have a lot of unnecessary challenges. Now, again, maybe in the context, they are necessary. Who knows, right? But I know, having gone into many experiences with that belief system and now doing it the other way, I just get better results, right? It's not even about like what's right or wrong or anything. I just simply get better results. Exactly with what you're talking about is exactly how I believe it. And that's why I truly believe that cannabis is so powerful, yet so slept on, because everyone is focused on obliterating the ego. But here's the thing that I've found, right, is that if we choose to believe like I do, that we're infinite beings, right? So whenever we kill the ego, wherever we go, we've been there forever and we'll be there forever, right? Which forever is a concept that's just not even really understandable in a finite human experience, right? But let's understand that we've been there forever. Well, we're here for not even a blink in time, right? So everyone's trying to kill their ego and get back there, but we came down here to be here, right? So again, like you were saying, it can be really powerful to remember, oh shit, I'm infinite. Okay, great. That's a really powerful and positive experience. But I think for a lot of people, they keep searching for that experience and they're trying to go home before they're ready to go home. Like you signed up to be on a mission here, right? It's almost like if, you're a kid and you go to camp, right? And you're really nervous your first day of camp. So you go there and, you get one day done and you're like, and you try making up all these excuses to your parents of why you shouldn't be there, right? And they know well enough to be like, just keep going, right? Like you're not getting bullied. You're just a little anxious, like keep going. Well, eventually you start really loving that experience because it proved to yourself that you could actually you could do the thing you were scared of, right? So I think a lot more people really are scared about living than dying. And I think that might be part of the unconscious reason that everyone is so identified with this ego death. I mean, again, I won't project. It's why I was, I'll put it that way. But when I realized that well, dude, yeah, now I know I'm infinite. I've had the experience. I don't care if anyone believes it. That's what I believe, right? So now I get to have this beautiful experience of this illusion of separation that the ego is the main driver being able to allow me to have that experience. Otherwise, I would just be one with God and everything would be perfect. And that's great, but I'm going to go back there. I've been there forever and I'll be there forever, just like we all will be, because we're all not drops in the ocean, but ocean in a drop, rather, as Rumi said. So it's being able to understand that allowed me to realize no, I actually really want to work with medicines that allow me to integrate literally on the fly. Like what's great about cannabis is, dude, I have a whole section of my phone called Ideas. And just when I'm connecting with cannabis, idea comes through, I can completely take out my phone, type it into Otter or speak it into Otter, hit stop record, put it down, go back into the experience, get another one, put it down. And in the morning I look at them like, this is pretty cool. And I go down, I'm like, that one, that's really cool. And then I go make posts about it or whatever, And so, it's like that synchronicity or that union, if you will, between the ego and all the other parts of me would allow me to do that. And also I've always been someone that I'd rather be friendly with everyone than or not everyone, I'll say it a different way. I'd rather be friendly with those I'm friends with than think that certain parts are better than others, and I got to kill certain, certain aspects of people to get them out of the way and things like that. It's like, for me, like going into things thinking that I want to kill a part of me has not led to desirable outcomes over time. And what I've realized is, there was a experience I had in Austin at a retreat where everyone was doing a high dose of mushrooms, and I just felt the call to go light. I went like 2 grams. And so I expected nothing. Like I was like, oh, this will be fun. I'll get to go go through some stuff. I'm going to go lay in the sun, just like process some stuff I've been feeling. And what ended up happening was I met my ego, and it was fucking cool, man. It was like this megalithic stone structure. Like when I was driving out to Phoenix, a lot of the Rocky Mountains, like they're very jagged and stuff, just like that. And I got to see how many things it was doing for me that I had never noticed before. Like just minute things of like, hey, heartbeat, check that out. Hey, this, check that out, right? So I got to see all these things it was doing behind the scenes to like keep me truly safe, right? And like really help me. But I also saw the ways in which it was programmed in ways that I was not liking. But I realized it wasn't the ego's fault it was programmed that way. It wasn't necessarily my fault, but it is my responsibility to take account for it now at this point in my life. And so I realized, I was like, man, the whole journey was just me being like, dude, game recognized game. And that's where I started saying that saying, because there was no other words. I was like, wow, okay, I see you now. Like, I totally see like whole parts of you. Like, that's when I really decided, I was like, I'm never going to use the terminology kill my ego again, because I want that part of me to be very alive, and I want it to know it's valued. But I also wanted to understand that it's not the only tool in the toolbox. And if it allows me to use some other tools, it can get better results as well, right? So when I've been having those conversations, I have much better experiences overall. And that's ultimately how I decide everything I do in life is, did it lead to better results? If so, I'm going to keep doing it, right? If it led to more negative results, then I'm going to look into it and change course a little bit, And so as I've been going through it that way, it's really helped a lot.
I think that's such a great avenue to take, of like recognizing where something is truly helping or where something and it's kind of like back to that apps like we were talking about. And we're 45 minutes in at this point in time, but if you guys haven't kind of recognized, this is more of a part 3 of our conversation. Part 2 kind of happened on Ryan's podcast. So if you really want to listen in order, maybe go ahead and just pause right now, go back and listen to that episode, and then come back to this one. But I'm sure there's part 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 that's going to come, because like we've said before, we could absolutely talk for hours on this stuff. But I think it's an important distinction to recognize that when you start to think of the ego more as the manager, like he's taking care of all of the tasks that you as the director don't really want to do. You don't have the time to do that. He's going to take care of everything in the background. But if you never have conversations with the manager, he's just going to do whatever he's going to do. So it's the director, us, the soul, that's really the one living this life. It's our job to have that open conversation with the manager at all times, so they know what their rules and responsibilities are and what their roles and responsibilities are not. And I think that's really the important thing about what's so beautiful of you having that conversation with the ego, is like, oh man, I actually recognize everything you do for me that I don't even have to think of. And if we had to like tangibly, logically process through all of the things that our ego and our body and everything does for us, we would be out of our minds. We couldn't get anything done.
Dude, 100%, man. And it's like, what an act of self-love too, as I've found, to be able to love the ego and love all parts of us, right? Like the whole idea of shadow work in a big way is to reclaim everything into our wholeness and see ourselves as God having a human experience, or whatever you choose to call it. And so the ego is a huge part of that. It's essential to be able to have this experience. And, I fully believe that I signed up for everything before I came down here, right? Soul contract, whatever you want to call it. That's what I choose to believe. And so in that vein, I realized that I'm like, oh man, this is probably the exact part in the story where I'm meant to realize this. And I have this fork in the road where, do I realize this and keep going in like a positive direction? Or do I go, no, and I reclaim, or I don't reclaim this aspect of me, and I keep going in a direction that's just not my greatest and grandest version of myself, And what I believe is that we all have infinite different destinies, right? Like destiny is a word that's thrown around a lot. And, people are like, well, you do believe in destiny. I'm like, a little bit. I think we have infinite different versions of it, but one is the greatest and grandest. And I think the pathway to whatever that destiny is ultimately loving ourselves and trusting in wherever our heart leads us. Like, I think we all have the internal compass to know exactly where we want to go. That's why, like, as kids, I think it's like not only are children our biggest teachers, I think, but also like we can learn about ourselves a lot from what we loved as kids because we were more following our heart at that point. The mind hadn't fully been formed yet. And so like being able to understand that if I can love myself and all parts of me, right, enough to be able to like be the director and actually like give direction where it's needed and make sure that like I understand that like, hey, it's up to me to do those things, right? And also in doing that, be able to create harmony in all the parts of myself that allow me to follow my heart and allow all these parts of me to help me in following that mission. Well, now I'm going to end up in my greatest and grandest version of destiny, right? And so for me, like everything, like is born and dies at being able to love myself and all parts of myself. And I think that, cannabis has helped so much in that because it illuminates all of you. And depending on what perspective you're in that day, you can see those parts that maybe you haven't looked at as like, oh my God, I had noticed that I was kind of a goofball from time to time. Or if you're in like a very challenging point of view, you would be like, oh my God, that part of me I don't like. But regardless of what perspective you're in, you can learn a lot about yourself, right? If you're in a positive mindset at the time where you notice a part of you that you haven't given love to or noticed a lot, you can laugh about it, right? And heal yourself through laughter. If on the other side, you notice a part of you that maybe you don't feel proud of or you feel shame around, you can learn a lot about where did I learn to feel that way about this part of me. But ultimately, no matter which way you go, so long as you stay curious, you're going to learn from it. And I really, again, to bring it all back circle, I feel like we're here to be learners. We're not here to be knowers, like when we're there, wherever there is, we know everything. We didn't come down here to be a know-it-all. We came down here to be a learn-it-all, And so for me anyway, that's how I choose to live because again, it's just the way that's led to more positive results in my life.
So much good stuff.
I know, dude.
And it's just like there's so much resonance to, and like we talked about it in the last podcast that we did of like truth bumps. Right? It's that physical sensation that arises within our body that lets us know that we are hearing something of such resonance that we know it to be true. And like so much of what you just said is really what I've come to same realizations through my life, granted on a different journey, but in the realization that like we have to encompass everything that we are. Everything that we like, everything that we don't like, everything that we have changed or want to change, and recognize that all of those parts of ourselves are important. It's not about getting rid of, and I've talked about this a couple of times on the podcast of like, I really dislike the term letting go because it's acknowledging or trying to acknowledge that there is a part of you that you do not need. But if we didn't need these parts of ourselves, we wouldn't have gone through the experiences that we went through. We wouldn't have been born into the situations that we were born in. We wouldn't find ourselves with the people in our lives that we have found within our lives. Like, I do believe everything happens for a reason. Like, whether it's predestined and we literally wrote this whole life before we came here, like as the belief of we're just living in the matrix and we're living this projection that we created before we came here to give us certain lessons, but we don't remember that, or whether it truly is up to fate and things happening in any particular certain way and order, whatever the truth to that is, everything happens for a reason. We're meant to experience the things that we're meant to experience because if we didn't experience those, we wouldn't actually receive the lessons that we're meant to receive. It's all about living this physical experience to the full ability that we possibly can to continue the collective consciousness expanding. And if we didn't push those limits, if we didn't learn those lessons, if we didn't have those hard times and hard experiences, we wouldn't be able to continue that expansion. We wouldn't be able to allow the universe to experience something different that it has never experienced before if we all stuck to the same rigid structure of life.
Exactly. And, I love what you said about everything happens for a reason. And, I truly believe that. And I believe that the scary slash most empowering thing is we get to decide what the reason is, and again, like I said, with intention with cannabis, right? If we don't make a reason, it doesn't mean that a reason didn't happen, right? Or that there wasn't a reason for it. It means that whatever unconscious programming that was running in our mind at that point created a reason that probably was disempowering. And so we start believing life is happening to us instead of realizing like, no, these reasons and this version of reality that I'm living has been projected from these unconscious parts of me that aren't bad. They're just like, dude, where's the script? Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing here. And you as the director is like, why is this movie not working out good? If only there was someone around here that could help like create order here. It's like, oh wait, that person is me. And when you realize that person is you, it doesn't mean that everything is sunshine and rainbows from then on, but it means that you're no longer stuck in a nihilistic point of view of everything just happens. There's no point to anything, because whether you choose to believe in God, source, whatever, you can believe in yourself, right? When you start doing that. And so even if you believe in yourself and nothing else, you're going to end up a lot better than if you were in that nihilism point of view. And so, yeah, it's 100%. It's like, it's a big responsibility, and it's the most fun responsibility, I think, to have, because it really allows you to encapsulate and embody the notion that you are the creator of your own reality. And I think that it's important to be able to take these concepts that are super powerful, but leave a lot of people with more questions than answers into like how this could actually look, and I think that's one of the best parts about podcasting is we get to talk about how we've done it. Maybe someone loves it and they do it that way. Maybe they're like, oh, actually, I could do it this way. Regardless, though, the idea is hopefully we're getting to inspire people to take their power back in their lives, because, we can have anything we want. It just depends on whether or not we're willing to love ourselves to the level where we can truly manifest what we do want rather than what we don't want.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point of like recognizing, and it's kind of back to acknowledging all those parts of ourselves. And you kind of touched on the inner child there for a little bit, and how I do a lot of inner child work. I have a specific breath work that is all about connecting with the inner child. In my opinion, the inner child is the one that's full of imagination. So if you're looking at your life of like, I don't know which way to go, I don't know how to create my own reality or how I want to create my own reality, that is your sign you need to connect with the inner child, because they have the answer. They're the ones that when you were a child, nothing was impossible. A stick was a sword, a broom was a horse, like everything that you could experience was all just up to your imagination or limited by your imagination. So if you're having a difficult time trying to create a certain reality or figuring out what you want to do in life, connect with the inner child and see what they have to say, because most likely they're going to have the answer.
100% agreed. The inner child is, if our innate state as human beings is joy, the easiest path to get there is through the inner child, because you look at children, like they are the ultimate encapsulation of joy. They go through emotions, sure, just like everyone, but they feel them fully and they return to joy. And then they go through emotions again and they return to joy, right? And we still have that ability. It's not like we're different than kids. We've just forgotten, and we piled a shit ton of papers on the table that is joy. And then we keep piling all these things on. Well, I must do all these things to access joy. And we just keep putting more cars into the metaphorical traffic jam of the mind, when in reality, it's not the mind's fault. It's that we're unaware that we can direct the mind, and we can actually like have these parts once again all be in harmony, and yeah, 100% agree with that. The inner child is the easiest way to access joy, and it's one of the parts that I feel a lot of people like just don't recognize in their life anymore, and it's sad, because without the inner child, life will get bland pretty quickly.
It's so true. So true. So Ryan, as we're nearing another hour of this beautiful conversation, why don't we go ahead and touch on like your offerings, and most specifically like Connect with Cannabis. Like if somebody really loves what you have to say and they want to dive deeper into their relationship with cannabis, whether that be trying to have a more conscious relationship with it or trying to figure out how can they approach it in more of a ceremonialistic fashion, why don't you give us some points on that?
For anyone out there that's curious about connecting with cannabis in the way that Adam and I have spoke of today, I have a program called Connect with Cannabis. And the reason I made it was because I wanted to, once again, be that middle way, right? So what we're going to give you is we're going to give you a lot of information. We're going to give you the science behind everything. We're going to give you how to facilitate it for individuals, how to coach individuals with cannabis, because we're a certification program. But the thing that is the cornerstone and the foundation of everything we do is the ability to be an experiential course. So I never want to just be a talking head, right? I never want people to take what I say at face value. They can get inspired by it, but I always want them to go try it themselves and figure out, how does this plant work for you in the way that I've talked about? Because it might be totally different, right? And so every single week we're going through a ceremony that you're doing on your own accord, and we're coming to the call to discuss our experiences, right? And so a lot of times, like the paradox that I talk about is that, yes, you will be a cannabis expert when you leave this program, and you'll be able to know how to coach others in doing the same thing. But at the same time, it's equally a course designed to talk about and really like focus on whatever comes up as a result of connecting with cannabis consciously. And so our next course that we're starting is on April 20th. This is our 13th group we've had go through. We're super, super excited. We have, I think, 2 spots left for that round, and we're going to be announcing more dates forthcoming. But it is so much fun, man. I mean, we have an absolute blast. People are able to open up so many new possibilities in the relationship. They're able to break dependency, create a healthy relationship with the plant, and open up the true psychedelic powers of the plant. Because like we were talking about earlier, like cannabis is 100% a psychedelic. It's just that most people that have been cannabis users for a long time have lost the ability to access those states on a scientific level because their endocannabinoid system is clogged, on a more spiritual level because they're codependent with the plant, and you can't have a power couple dynamic and a codependent relationship at the same time. And so being able to go through that program, like we joke often, we have the most fun homework on the internet, bar none. Like, where else are you going to be instructed to connect with cannabis and do things such as, you know, if you're with a romantic partner, experience connection by having a lovemaking session, accessing your inner child and taking yourself on a play date, being able to manifest into your future and feel the feelings of your future as if they've already occurred, like Joe Dispenza, right? Being able to go into breath work and understand how cannabis can enhance breath work by increasing melatonin, which is a precursor to endogenous DMT. Being able to dive into the music that you're currently resonating with and what that's saying about your emotional status underneath, right? Like, we get into so much fun stuff, man. And so if anyone's interested, you can definitely find the link. You can find it a couple different places. You can find it on my website at highlyoptimized.me. You can find it on my Instagram. But go in and book a qualifying call. You'll meet with my buddy Alex, my business partner, and he'll go over everything with you, and then you'll get passed along to me, and we'll get you into the program. And it's super fun. You know, we have a blast doing it. Like I said before, I got to pinch myself most days to make sure I'm not dreaming. And for anyone that's interested in growing as well, we have the Grow with Cannabis course, which is my full entire rundown of how I cultivate organic cannabis, just like you and I were talking about, Adam. So yeah, that's where you can find out about the program, and it's super fun. You know, if anyone has questions, I'm free to answer anything in my DMs. So yeah, come on through.
Well, Ryan, I know you got to run. Thank you so much for your time, so much for your knowledge and wisdom. Absolutely love talking with you. And I'll have all of Ryan's contact information in the show notes below so you guys can connect with him. Thank you again for being here. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Embrace and Expand podcast, and I'll catch you on the next one.